Psalm 127. The psalmist reflects on a home dedicated to the Lord and blessed with many children. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards the city, the guard keeps watch in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives sleep to his beloved. Sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Mark 12:38 through 44. In the gospel reading, Jesus lifts up a poor but generous widow. As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, they say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." As he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury, many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came in and put 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called to his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on."
I have a confession to make. On Halloween, we buy more candy than we have trick-or-treaters. So there will be plenty left for us. We buy the mixed bags that have certain things we like. And when trick-or-treaters come to the door, well, I give them the ones that I don't like as much. Does anyone else do that? Come on, you can be honest. And how about this? We give our old clothing that is getting worn or doesn't fit anymore to the clothes closets. We give our used household items to DAV or Habitat Restore. We give away what we don't or can't use anymore. Now, don't get me wrong, giving away is better than throwing away. But we hardly ever give our best things. And we never give everything, right? Well, in the reading from Mark's Gospel, a poor widow does just that. As the reading begins, Jesus is in the midst of an ongoing battle with the scribes. They were educated religious leaders who loved the appearance of piety and wisdom and expected to sit at places of honor. Yet they did little for the poor and vulnerable except to benefit from them. Maybe the scribes were more concerned with what they had instead of the needs of those around them. Now, I must point out the irony of preaching this sermon, standing here in a long robe, as someone who enjoys a certain amount of respect in the public sphere, who sometimes gets seats of honor and sometimes says long prayers. If we see this as an indictment against the scribes, we must also acknowledge our similarities to them. When it comes time for the temple offerings, Jesus watches as the rich give little, but the poor widow gives little that is much, actually all, and her generosity goes unrecognized by everyone except Jesus. By our middle-class values, this widow's decision is questionable. We plan carefully to maintain a certain standard of living for our whole lives. It makes no sense to us to give everything we have to the church. And by the way, that is not what the church asks of us. Yet that is what the widow chooses to do. When she gives her last mites to the temple treasury, she is offering a sacrifice to God. She drops in 2 lepta, copper coins of little value, but it was everything she had to live on, literally her whole life. Maybe she knew she didn't have enough to live on anyway, and she may as well give it to the institution that she trusted would take care of her, according to the law, which in Deuteronomy calls for provision for those who have no allotment or inheritance. Perhaps she hoped that she could rely on what James called pure religion, caring for the orphans and widows, and that her neighbors would open their hearts to her in her need. We should not be surprised that Jesus makes an example of this widow. His idea of discipleship is calling people to give their all, to leave family, leave friends, leave livelihood, take up your cross and follow me. And while Paul reminds us that there are many gods and many lords vying for our sacrifices, this widow gets it right. She gives her whole life to God. Yet the story is about more than that. While it exemplifies the woman's actions, it also exposes the religious leaders for their hypocrisy. Jesus calls out the scribes for their pride and their showy actions. But he goes even farther, questioning their economic policies. It's not really clear what the NRSV means by "they devour widows' houses," whether it means they take their houses away or they use up all their resources. It's complicated. But suffice to say that widows were being exploited. Jesus sees that this woman is caught in the middle of systems vying for power. His commendation of the widow and her giving is actually a condemnation of the scribes and a challenge to be more just. Some have suggested that perhaps Jesus is expressing remorse because the widow has given away what little she has. In that case, it would be a critique against the practice of allowing, let alone encouraging, this woman to give all she had to live on. Jesus would not support a temple whose leaders he regarded as corrupt and exploitative. It reminds us that we should stand up for those who are vulnerable and against those who exploit the poor. While this story exposes the actions of the scribes, it also exposes our society that is too good at ignoring the poor. New Testament scholar Greg Carey points out the honorable poverty of our ancestors. Back in the early days of the last century, when everybody was poor, cash was short and luxuries few. Back when most people owned their land and raised most of their food. More so than we, they could identify with poverty in the ancient world, and Jesus' stories that call attention to the plight of the poor. Here, Jesus counts the widow's small offering as greater than the large amounts given by the rich. Now, some preachers use this passage as a basis for stewardship sermons, calling us to emulate this widow. I think they have the wrong idea. If we think we could ever put ourselves in this widow's place, then we misunderstand. Take a look at her situation. She is a woman and a widow. That's two strikes against her in the ancient world, where women were dependent on men for their livelihood and sustenance, and widows, if they didn't have relatives or sons to provide for them, were left to depend on the generosity of others. Most of us have no idea what that is like. It may seem odd to us that Jesus is sitting there watching what people put in the offering. Because here at South Street, we practice anonymous giving. What you give is between you and God. Let me be clear that I do not know what any of you give. Only our financial secretary and our treasurer have access to that information. And there are those who would disagree with our practice. Methodist minister James C. Howell tells this story. The idea of anonymous giving worried Martin Luther King Sr. when he began his ministry at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1931. He believed anonymous giving provided a grand excuse for what he called anonymous non-giving. You follow me? So he opened the registers and listed what each person gave for everybody to see. Donations soared in just a week. I'm thinking we have found our stewardship emphasis for next year. Just kidding. But even if the pastor or the whole church doesn't know what you give, God knows. But God also knows our struggles and when we are hard-pressed to make ends meet, and calls us to notice those who have been discriminated against or exploited, to help them find relief, and to work for a more just society. We might think this passage is about stewardship, but it is about much more. It is about power. Having come through a very contentious election season, we have seen firsthand how ugly the struggle for power can be. Tuesday night, as election returns poured in, we watched the networks report on how each victory changed the balance of power in Congress, and heard commentary about what the party in power would do. I commented to Mark that I wish we could just get rid of political parties and let individuals run on their own merits. Make it about why we should vote for them, not why we shouldn't vote for their opponent. Put limits on the insane amount of money that is spent on advertising, and set a shorter time for campaigning. Can I get a second to that motion? But I want to point out that in a few local races, it was not negative. And that's the way it should be. But even those races get caught up by the political machine and are sometimes determined by party affiliation and whether your state or district is mostly red or blue. Now, you might think that there is a typo in the sermon title in the bulletin. Isn't it supposed to be a widow's mite, M-I-T-E? It is that. But in his recognition of her sacrifice, Jesus gives this widow power. And it is that power, that might, M-I-G-H-T, that is greater than our most generous gifts or our grandest buildings. It sets the example for true commitment, not just for those scribes and disciples who were watching, but for us as well. Lutheran pastor David Lowes sees this as a cautionary tale about how easy it is to cave into our insecurity and cultural messages of scarcity and be seduced to look out for number one. It is a call for us not to calculate our worth according to our possessions, but to be stewards of each other and concerned with the welfare of our whole community. So perhaps from this cautionary tale, we can learn not only to rethink how we share our Halloween candy, but more importantly, how we understand our own discipleship. May it be so. Amen.